Speaking of clients, one thing that vexes them a lot, any of my clients from wherever they've broad spectrum of familiarity with technology, doesn't have, but with podcasting is hosting your podcast and where it goes. And that's what, feel free to ask questions as I go here. I don't have a prepared spiel other than you can see a couple notes that I've written down, but the idea of how you host your podcast and then how it gets out into the world seems to really vex people. And even people who do website stuff are kind of like confused by it a lot often. And so I thought I'd just do a quick little stream on this to explain some of this. And yeah, if anybody's out there and has questions about this as I go, or if I skip over something that seems to make sense, or it doesn't make sense, obviously, then feel free to throw that in the chat. And if you're watching this later, if I do publish it on YouTube, then feel free to put in the comments below, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. So I've taken the approach, much like with the Rogue Amoeba apps and Ecamm Live, of having a somewhat opinionated in a polite Canadian way view on how to host your podcast. I think of it as either you're free and you're just doing it as a hobby and you don't really care, you don't want to put money into it, you're just sort of trying it out. In that case, by all means, use something like Anchor. It's free. It's owned by Spotify. There's a few caveats and things you should be just aware of when you're hosting a podcast. Oh, turn off the old disturby things. That because they're owned by Spotify could change the terms of service to maybe allow them to insert ads into your podcast whether you wanted them or not, or change the ads that they're already there if you already enabled ads in your podcast. You can make a couple bucks off of advertising on there sometimes, but a lot of the ads were being paid for by Spotify or Anchor themselves initially, just to try and grow the marketplace for ads. And so I don't think you're going to get rich unless you have a huge audience. And so in which case, then I think you're better off probably trying to monetize it yourself. But there's a sweet middle ground there where you can make a few bucks off your podcast, much like what I'm doing with YouTube, right? You just throw some ads on, let them monetize it, see what happens. And they have a great iOS app, mobile app. I think it's Android as well now, where you can actually do it right from the app, record your podcast right from the app and publish it and insert music and edit your podcast and stuff right from the iOS app or Android app, mobile app, and works really well and is fun to use, especially if you're wanting sort of like a podcast on the go, maybe a 5-minute audio journal every day or whatever kind of creation you might be having for your podcast. That's where it works really well. And because they own, full stack essentially of like recording and then publishing your podcast, and they host it there. All podcast hosts, just a note on distribution, because this is often one that comes up, is how do I get my podcast out to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, to insert whatever platform, Google Podcasts. Every podcast host, if they're worth their salt, will take care of publishing your podcast to Apple Podcasts everywhere else. It's kind of like, it's based on RSS, so if you're a tech geek, that's what's running behind the scenes. But basically any platform can then distribute that to any other platform that is just a marketplace, essentially a listing service for podcasts. So Apple Podcasts doesn't actually host your podcast. Spotify kind of does, because they take it and host it and distribute it from there. So there's some issues there maybe. Google Podcasts, I don't think, they just redirect back to your feed URL, the podcast host, wherever that MP3 is. Andrew made 625 with 10 episode podcasts and 648 total plays with Anchor. So there you go. I mean, it's not nothing. It's, bought you a coffee, I guess, at Starbucks and as long as you're having fun with it. But I don't think you should be don't use Anchor thinking it's going to get you rich if you don't already have an audience that's wanting to listen to your podcast. I guess it's much more difficult to go viral with a podcast than with even YouTube. I think you'd be better off if you're trying to go famous and rich on the internet. I think you have better odds on YouTube with some sort of just hitting random how do I kind of videos and going that route than with a podcast platform. So Anchor for free, paying for it. I think I like Transistor a lot because of the main thing they do. One of the biggest things they do is allow you to, rather than paying for per podcast, you pay for the amount of downloads. And so, which sounds scary maybe, because you think, well, what if I get famous and I'm going to have my podcast go crazy viral and then I'm going to be paying through the nose to Justin and John at Transistor. But I can assure you, unless you have an audience, a huge audience already, and you would have no problem pitching any number of companies or products in your niche for a sponsorship, you're not going to go over the monthly download limits. We have, just for an example, Good Stuff, the podcast network I do with some friends. Right now we have 3 or 4 active shows, but at various times we've had all of these shows and varying levels of success, and have never hit that. So, time to stand. And so I think don't worry about that. If that comes, if you're hitting the monthly downloads of 15,000 per month, then you have the ability to charge sponsors for it, or maybe hit up Patreon or buy me a coffee links or whatever, those kinds of things to monetize your podcasts, hopefully. So what I like about Transistor's model is, because of that, you can, just like what we're doing with Good Stuff, you can try a bunch of different podcast ideas and see what sticks. You're not locked into hosting a podcast and paying for it forever, and then you just pivot maybe to a new podcast, and then you're sort of stuck paying for 2 podcasts then, because a lot of the podcast hosts will be in the $10 to $20 a month range just for one show. Some of them will be a little cheaper. Libsyn you can get by with a $6 to $8 a month plan, I think it is, with minimal stats and things like that. But I like Transistor's model of just, it frees you up from that question each time you're wanting to start a podcast of, do I want to pay? Is it worth it? Do I want to pay for it? And should I start it or not? The one thing you can do, just to caveat this is you can start on Anchor for 6 months or a year or 10 years or whatever you do your podcast for, and then you can import it into something like Transistor very easily. So it's not that difficult to move your podcast. It's much easier than even, say, services like when you're web hosting. It's a bit of a pain to move web hosts. It can be done, but it's a lot of work to move your WordPress install, let's say, from one site to another. Not so with podcast hosting, at least as it stands right now in 2021. They all have tools to import and move things around very easily, so you're not really locked in. So then, just to show you what from here, you sign up with Transistor. This is the back end of what we use for managing Good Stuff, and you can see all the various shows that we have had over the years. 17 shows here, and I'll just use my own podcast for an example. When you're setting up your podcast for the first time, you set up, name, description, artwork. Looks really great. I think I need to update it. Podcast artwork looks kind of gross. Categories, etc. You can update the important copyright information, and decide whether it's a seasonal podcast, for example. All this kind of stuff. This is all consistent across many podcast hosts, but I know Transistor does it really well, and you can lock it from being imported. Not a huge deal, but anyways, set up your podcast like that. Transistor and many hosts also build in the ability to have a website. So, for example, I have lemon.transistor.fm is my podcast host or website for it. That lives on, as well as I have it actually linked at my website as a CNAME redirect. Transistor supports that. So podcast.lemonproductions.ca. That all lives on there. And once you have that all configured, which I'm kind of glossing over, but once you have that all configured, then you can actually distribute, whatever, your podcast. So Transistor builds you an RSS feed automatically. That's what you can tell folks to subscribe with. That's the only way we used to distribute podcasts back in the day, was just give them an RSS feed and they'd have to figure it out. But then, of course, you can submit your show now to popular directories: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcast. I don't even know half of these. I've never used half of them, but Transistor actually takes care of submitting to a lot of them. And then any of the other ones that you want to do, you can do manually yourself. That out there, most of them will actually pick up off of whatever Apple Podcast lists and will be there. So like Deezer or whatever might actually have my show listed. I just haven't bothered to put in what the URL is at that particular podcast host. So when you click through and set up a new show with Transistor, you submit it to the various directories that you want to be listed in. And that's it. Then you don't have to go back, and each time you have a new episode, you have to go update Spotify, go update Apple Podcasts, etc. It's there forever until they decide, I guess, to stop your show, or you decide to stop. And you can see that very easily in Transistor's page. Anyways, they build for you a subscribe page based on all those shows that you put into the distribution page, where it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, etc. And so people can just hit up the /subscribe page and find out and subscribe. Find out where to subscribe and how to get there. I have integrated also an email newsletter that they have. I think I set it up with MailerLite, I believe. That's one of the integration options. Yeah, MailerLite. You can have it auto tweet and then also auto post to YouTube, which apparently is not working right now, but I'm not going to worry about that. And then Zapier integration as well. So distribution basically handles and takes care of getting your podcast out into the world so that people who use Apple Podcasts will find it, people who use Spotify only will find it, etc. You don't have to worry about that once it's gone. From there, once that's set up, when you publish a new episode, so just for example, how to get involved in podcasting as a business back in November 2019, in the before times. Transistor, per episode, you set up a title for the episode, you drag your audio file in, you put a summary for the episode in here, put as much as you want down here in terms of show notes and things like that. And then where people often get confused as well is how do I display that? How do I share an episode with my audience, my social media following maybe, and my website? What should I do? So my approach is I take, like as you've seen, I make use of Transistor's built-in webpage to be the home of my websites or my podcast, sorry. So whatever URL you decide, podcast.whatever or yourshow.website.com or whatever you decide, that to me is the home base for my podcast and sort of where it lives on the web. It's then distributed from this to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. But this is sort of the home base. If someone said, hey, I want to find your podcast, find out more about it, I would send them to podcast@lemonproductions.ca and maybe right to the subscribe page, and they could figure out where to subscribe there, or maybe to a specific episode on the podcast app site, whatever. My brain is foggy. But once an episode is published, you can either view that specific episode on Transistor's page, let's say, or Transistor builds you this social media landing page, which this little URL is handy for sharing out Twitter. Who knows what we're going to see here. Sharing out on social media and links player, etc. It works on Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And that's how you can share the direct link to the episodes. They get a player right away. There's a few key subscribe buttons here where they follow you, tweet about it. So that's included. And then you can also, if you have, what I also do is lemonproductions.ca. This will be a little ways back because I don't have on my actual business site. Probably easier to search for this, but where are we here? Back when I was actually publishing podcast episodes of my own. Thanks, Andrew, for stopping by. Hope you have a good meeting. Anyways, I put a blog post in as well for my podcast on my site. I publish it as a blog post. This isn't the canonical sort of source for my podcast. I still tell people to go to Apple Podcasts, etc., to subscribe. Visit the subscribe page on Lemon Productions podcast page, and then I use the embed code from Transistor. Chose the dark theme. Stick that embed code in an HTML block inside of WordPress, but whatever website hosting you're using will work just fine. And so people can still play it there.
Hello, my name is Chris Enns. I run Lemon Productions.
And it works as a player there, but then if they really want to subscribe, of course, like I said, I have multiple ways you can find the subscribe links, either in here, I put the main four that I think of, or they're there, or you can subscribe to the email newsletter, etc. So yeah, Chris hosting Chris. Chris's voice on top of Chris. Chris doesn't like hearing Chris's voice. I hate walking into a room if somebody's listening to my podcast in any form, whatever podcast. So if you want to get me to leave your house or place, just start playing one of my podcasts and I'll run, or YouTube videos or whatever. So that's it. So basically what I would recommend folks do is you have your business website or your blog or whatever, set up a podcast site with Transistor so that it's at a CNAME redirect. So the podcast.lemonproductions.ca or whatever your website is, lemonproductions.ca, swap that out for your website and then put podcast or show name or whatever you want to use. You can set that up inside of Transistor with their custom domain redirect here. That's all I have to do. And then from there, also publish it as a blog post on your existing, assuming you have a blog of some sort on your business website or your personal blog or wherever your podcast or your brand is online, as a place to just also reference it so that your existing, I've had people searching for whatever topic find it on my blog, because my blog has a higher Google ranking because of other stuff, other content on my site than this podcast subdomain does. I think I'm not an expert in SEO, but and that's where then that podcast can be found through Google searches, etc. But then, like I said, the canonical kind of home for it is podcast.lemonproductions.ca. So I think I've answered all of those questions. Where do I put my podcast? Do I embed it on a website? Where should it go? What do I share on social media? So that's where, at least for Transistor, embeddable HTML player goes on your blog post, let's say. Social media landing page goes on social, obviously. One other cool thing they've got is you can, where is it? RSS feed, website, distribution, episodes, yeah. You can embed the latest player. So that'll just put whatever on your web page, you can have like a /podcast page maybe, and whatever the latest, most recent episode is will just automatically get embedded there. So as I add new episodes, it'll swap out this episode for the newest one. Or you can have it embed a playlist. So it'll obviously have your most recent one and then the last 15 or whatever episodes. You can change that setting, but however many episodes you want it to list in the player. So then it's kind of a neat way to just have it automatically get updated. You don't even have to touch your website. If you don't want to do the blog post for each episode is in addition, you can just have this embeddable audio player list and have all your shows just appearing, all your new episodes appearing right there automatically. So that is feels like a very quick run through on podcast hosting and distribution. Like I said, opinionated podcast hosting in a Canadian friendly manner. I like to recommend Transistor for the ability to be flexible and not have to overthink the cost of hosting your podcast, but your mileage may vary or your dollars that you want to throw into podcast hosting, especially if it's just an idea for fun, then something like Anchor is a great way to start out and try. But even using Transistor with a couple of friends, that's what, like we said, with Good Stuff, having the ability to do podcasts with a bunch of friends and publish multiple shows without having to decide whether it's worth chipping in, $3 a month each or whatever. We do have a Patreon, patreon.com/goodstuff, that helps support the network and helps pay for some of the hosting and domain names and all that stuff that's been built up over a long time. But yeah, I just went down a dark rabbit hole of podcasting. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Becky Swim. I forgot who. I think that's Todd maybe in real life. I forget who that is. And maybe you don't want your name to be known. That's fine. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off for now. I'm not sure. I've been testing out. Yes. Okay. So I mentioned Patreon. I've been testing out this Buy Me a Coffee site too. They have a iOS app that's really nice, and so if you're so inclined, you want to throw a buck or two, or you can do the Twitch thing or whatever. But I'm just sort of testing it out as a way of, like, instead of Patreon, it seems more friendly to people. I guess it's easier to use. It's nicer to look at. It's not as complicated to get going. Just not so much for me exactly, but just in terms of what I'd recommend to people, to clients and stuff who are looking to do some sort of like crowdfunding or support for their various ventures. So, and if you follow me on Twitter or my YouTube channel, I think later today in about an hour, I'm going to be actually producing a live stream recording for a client. Alt Goes Mainstream is the podcast, and talking about finance and stuff. So that's coming up in about just under an hour. So on that note, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for watching, whoever's out there in the internet lands, and we'll see you next time.